Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Tyrannical, Inspiring, Necrotic, and for anybody still listening, Prideful. So it's a nasty combination of affixes that really at any keystone level is going to be felt pretty acutely by multiple members of your group, especially your tank though. Necrotic is always something that tanks are going to feel, but when combined with Inspiring, it adds a further wrinkle in any designs they may have to run away from mobs, to, hit them with the AoE stun and then leap out kind of thing. So that's off the table in a lot of spots, and it's also, you have all this extra stuff to coordinate around the Inspiring affix as well. So that all combines with Tyrannical as well. So you have the slower pulls, right? Because you're doing the CC for the Inspiring and stuff, and that making stuff take longer. And you're doing Necrotic kiting potentially, making stuff take longer. But it's Tyrannical week, so you can't afford for stuff to take that much longer, or else you're going to miss your timer, right? Because the boss fights take so long. And you have the brutal combination of Tyrannical and Necrotic, which for a couple tank specs, especially non-Kyrian tanks who don't have that File of Serenity to bail them out, and on a couple of boss fights in particular, some of the harder boss fights in the patch, in the expansion, there's really not too much to be done on some of those. Some of them just really hurt your tank. So it is an extremely tank difficulty intensive and gear intensive week. It's going to be a week where if you are a tank player who's interested in doing keys, you will be flooded with requests to play. If you're a geared tank, that is. If you're an under-geared tank, it's going to be brutal and hellish, and you might not be able to find people even who want to go through it as well. But if you're a geared tank, you're going to be in very high demand. If you're not a tank player, you don't know any tank players, it's going to be hard to find them. So if you do find one, keep them close, safeguard them, make sure that no other groups snatch them up, get to run any keys with them. So that's this week. It is extremely tricky one. Don't be discouraged if you find dungeons really hard this week. It's one of the hardest weeks on the calendar for most players at most key levels. This one is just all around rough. We will, however, go dungeon by dungeon, take a look at my routes, which have mostly not changed. A couple of them have changed since last week, but they're really getting pretty stable now. So I think they're mostly going to be the same for the rest of the season. This set of routes that we have now, probably through the end of the season, only on bolstering weeks will there be sizable changes. There are some ways that you can play around Inspiring, and particularly if you're an expert group, there are some pulls that you're going to want to do a little differently. There are some ways that you're going to want to kind of play around it, but I haven't included any of that stuff in my routes because really the answers to Inspiring are going to depend on your group. We can talk a little bit about some of those, right? So there's obviously the default strategy is CC the Inspiring mob and kill it after the pack. A strategy you can do, particularly if you have a lot of burst damage, depending on what the pack is just focus down the Inspiring mob first. And if you can do that effectively before there's another dangerous cast from a non-Inspiring mob, totally valid strategy as well. There are also a lot of packs where it's just not that bad to let any of the other mobs cast, and so you can, again, just fight those like normal, basically. Just know that it's going to be harder for your tank because of that Necrotic affix at the end. Another strat that I really like, actually, I love doing this whenever possible, is if the Inspiring mob is not CC immune, so if it's knockable, then you can fight the pull, right? And if there's, say, one kick you really need to land, and it's going to come up before the Inspiring mob dies, you can, like, Typhoon or Thunderstorm, knock the mob out of the pack, death grip it away if you've got a Death Knight that can run away and death grip. Anything like that, you displace the Inspiring mob away from the pack and then land your kick, and then the Inspiring mob comes back in and nothing else matters again for as long as the Inspiring mob is around, right? And this is something I loved doing with Beguiling as well, but I think it's a really good strategy if you have the ability to do it in your group. It's somewhat spec dependent, though. There's only a couple specs that have those sorts of effects. So, look out for opportunities to do that. I think that saves a lot of time, because the default strategy of CCing Inspiring mob and then killing it after the pack is over is pretty slow. If you do need to do that, I would recommend CC the Inspiring mob, nuke down whichever mob you need to kick, and then bring the Inspiring mob in with the rest of the pull. Again, obviously that's complicated by Necrotic because you may have 30 stacks of Necrotic at that point and you're not in any position to be adding anything to the pool and you're just running for your life for a while. So that's the challenge of this week, and that's part of why this week is so hard, is that combination of effects happening. But that is something to look to try and do. The final strategy is in a couple spots there are multiple Inspiring Mob packs nearby each other, like relatively close. And so what you can do in those cases is actually leave the Inspiring Mob CC'd and then deal with them all together at the end. They will grant each other Inspiring Aura, which means if there's like two of them next to each other, you're not kicking either of them. So if there's important casts on those Inspiring Mobs, this is not a valid strategy. But if there's not, then this is a really good way of minimizing that efficiency loss, because you're not going to be fighting any single target, right? You're going to always be fighting AoE pulls, and you're only, like, say there's 3 packs, right? That each have 1 Inspiring Mob in them. Instead of doing that in 6 total pulls, right? Of pack and then Inspiring Mob, pack, Inspiring Mob, pack, Inspiring Mob. You're fighting it in 4 pulls, which is still worse than the 3 you normally do, but better than 6. So those are some of the different ways that you can kind of conceptualize this. It'll depend a lot on your group composition, what is possible. For a lot of dungeons, for a lot of key levels, slow and steady is going to win the race. Just make sure you don't wipe to these things. But you will be surprised, actually. I imagine there will be a lot of groups that will run into timers this week in dungeons at key levels where on most weeks you don't run into timers because it's just such a slow and grindy combination of affixes, and it's so likely to cause problems that potentially can lead to wipes. So again, just don't be discouraged if that happens to you. No big deal. Come back next week. Much more favorable affixes then. Alright, so dungeon by dungeon. I'm not going to go too long dungeon by dungeon this week because it's so bad everywhere. It's brutal. All dungeons are rough. But if you're interested in picking up the routes, of course, they are on Raider.io every week. Link in the description below, of course, to them as well. There's a route with skips and without for each dungeon. And again, they're pretty locked down at this point. They're getting pretty stable. The other side, we'll start here. This is a dungeon where Tyrannical Necrotic's tough on a couple of the bosses, although it's actually not too bad because you get natural resets on most of these bosses. Like on Moisalia, you get natural resets. On Hakar even, you can reset pretty easily. And the boss fight. And you can reset on Dealer also. The Mana Storms can be tricky. What you want to do here is make sure you can land a reset during the phase transition if you are high on stacks. A lot of times you're not going to be high on stacks because they cast quite a bit, but sometimes if you are, like particularly if you're coming into Maleficent's phase with Necrotic stacks active on you, that's a very dangerous phase because she does a lot of tank damage with her bleed. So if that somehow has happened to you, you're going to want to maybe kite until your stacks drop before you let her land an auto on you. So it's not, I would say that comes up maybe 10% of the time you're fighting this boss, something like that, where you're coming into that phase with more than like a couple stacks. But if it does happen, it's really important to make sure that you don't refresh your stacks with Maleficent hitting you. Okay. Halls of Atonement. So Halls of Atonement, there's actually a lot of Necrotic trash pull difficulty. I would say the trash pulls are the main Necrotic threat in this dungeon, rather than the bosses themselves. The route that I have here is a route that I think this is a generally good plan for the dungeon, which is to set up Bloodlusts you just fire one off on this first trash pull, and then you kill a bunch of trash. And you get it potentially in this fight or potentially in this fight, depending on how fast you're going. And you get a pride onto just this boss. You can organize your trash to get a pride onto this boss as well. And you can then like rush to this boss with very little trash and a 40 or 60% pride, and then take the 80% pride onto this boss. And that gets you more prides onto bosses. I tend to not think that's worth it even on Tyrannical weeks, but that is an option. My routes don't do that though. They instead do a bunch of trash here. Or at least the with skips route does. The no skips route. The no skips route is a way that does it the other way, but it pulls some kind of weird trash here because obviously you can't skip it. So pick your poison there, I guess. And yeah, these bosses all give your tank natural opportunities to reset. So this is one of the best dungeons for your tanks to survive the bosses. but it is actually one of the hardest ones to survive the trash with Necrotic, if you are unable to kite. I mean, it's one where you're basically just going to have to kite, especially anytime you're fighting any of the Gargans. Your tank should just be out of there at like 50% or something. Just do not let those things hit you. When they are big, or when you have Necrotic stacks, you're going to die. And as long as you can do that, all the bosses just reset your stacks for you, which is really nice. Mists, not a dungeon that I think this is another very good target for this week. It's good. It's a good dungeon every week, but Necrotic in particular. Again, the bosses here on Tyrannical. None of them. So they're some of them are slogs on Tyrannical, but none of them are like tank buster bosses, right? And that is something that tank buster bosses this week get really amplified by Necrotic, and these bosses don't really fit that mold. They all offer opportunities to reset as well. One thing to do on Tredova in particular is if your tank has stacks and your healer can survive it, it's often going to be a good idea to let Tredova channel for a couple seconds for your tank to drop stacks in Necrotic before landing the interrupt. That saves you potentially quite a bit of life. So do that if you can survive it. If you can't, I mean, your tank can potentially kite to try and reset as well, and just start running away, because she'll like go back towards the middle of the room to start her consumption cast anyway, so you can potentially make some distance and then use the her moving there and to start making more distance away from her. Plaguefall. Okay, so Plaguefall, also a dungeon where Necrotic can be a bit of a pain. There are some spots where you're kind of in these long combat chains in particular, but as long as you're making sure that nothing is like sticking to you and autoing you for a really long time, you're making sure that you are kiting as needed, it should be okay. It will save you a lot of life if you can make sure that you land the explosions, right? So what you really want to make sure you have happen, or you avoid happening, is like the situation where you get to 30 stacks Necrotic, and that's when the Plague Borer starts to explode, and so you're caught between the rock and the hard place where you want to kite, but you also want to keep all the mobs in the explosion. In those cases, do everything you can to keep the mobs in the explosion. Use whatever defensives you need to, because that's going to save you so much time, and it's going to make you a lot safer. But ideally, what you want to do is you want to be kiting before the Plague Borers start their explosion, and then that means you'll have less stacks, and you can then face tank them for a while and group them up as the Plague Borers get into the explosion range, as the barrel gets into the explosion range, and prevent that from being a problem. So that's how I'd handle this part of the dungeon this week. Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths, so there's a couple bosses in this dungeon that maybe a rude awakening for less geared tanks. In particular, like this first boss, I imagine is going to brick wall quite a lot of tanks this week with Tyrannical Necrotic. So make sure you come in here with all your cooldowns. If you can avoid using your cooldowns on these pulls, actually, it's a really good idea. So that can be a great argument for making sure you CC out the inspiring mob and kill it after. Because even if you could theoretically do it with the inspiring mob coming in, which by the way you shouldn't mess around with that because of the consume cast or the engorge cast these things do. You really want to be able to kick those if you can, but making these pulls a little bit slower and safer is going to make the boss a lot safer for your tank if they can save their meta or their last resort, or their shield wall last stand type effects, any of that kind of stuff. Really nice to have for the boss. Curian File also very big to clear stacks. Of course, you can kite a little bit on this boss as well during the Juggernaut charge, right? Like that's you get a long time after that to run away and not let it auto you. So be vigilant for opportunities to drop stacks if you are in that tanking role. It's usually not going to be a high amount of stacks in Necrotic that kill you. It's usually just like this boss is already hitting the tanks really hard, and so like a little bit of extra damage and healing reduction on top can sometimes be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Spires of Ascension, this route I've changed around a little bit, the with skips route for this week. So this is a going right instead of going left plan. I'd say this is a little bit of a harder strategy, but it does the dungeon in quite a bit less pulls, and I think there's quite a bit of elegance to it as well that the old route didn't have. So the idea now in the dungeon is you come up the middle, obviously. By the way, even on non-inspiring weeks you should do this, but on inspiring weeks it's especially important. you CC this Mender in this pack, and you still get 20%, and you get your Pride, and then you can kill the Mender with the Pride. And the Mender actually casts this Armaments, this Imbued Weapons thing, and if you purge that instead of interrupting it, then it'll drop the weapon on the ground, somebody runs over it, and their auto attacks get mega empowered for the next like 5 autos. You can either use that on the Pride or take it into the boss and use it on the boss. And so do that for this pull. It's a good idea basically on every week actually, but especially on Inspiring Week. That mob is an Inspiring mob. So do that if you can. So then the idea is we're going left, we're grabbing these 8 mobs, or these 7 mobs. They fix these finally so that they don't evade on pull. And what you want to do is you want to like tag them and then group them up behind this wall, nuke them down for a bit, and then start kiting as needed. The skirmishers are a little bit of a pain, obviously, because they do the hurl, so it's something that you're going to want to stand in for a while, and then you can abuse line of sight on the staircase as well to make this pull a little bit easier. And then you come around over here, doing another pull on this area. Both of these pulls are tough, and you can split them into half, each of them, and that's totally fine. The route will still work just fine. This spawns your Pride, which then with the Pride buff, you can make this double pull work in theory, or you can just do this in halves as well. Again, that's totally valid strat. It's a very tough combination of affixes, so do that if you want to. My advice would be to take the Pride into this pack first, and then back pull this pack. You can just walk around the side, and this won't pull. And this pack's a bit harder and a little bit of a nicer target to sink your Pride into. Then we keep on pulling, and then we got our 60% Pride here, and then with the Kyrian Spear that you've picked up from the ground here, and the Pride buff, you can nuke all of this down in like 10 seconds with that Kyrian Spear with the Pride buff, and so that saves you a ton of time if you can do that. And then we're making our way up over here. This spawns us our 80% Pride. We go to boss with our 80% Pride. We come up here, we grab this Hellion all by itself, which is a little slow, but it's a nice way to make the count work, and a lot of people have been telling me, actually, that this mob is hard to skip. Like, it's hard for people to do the jump on the brazier thing and skip around it, so whatever, just pull that thing. It's really not that bad. It's a nice little cooldown recovery opportunity as well. And skip through these packs by whatever means you like. Either a long shroud can do it, or there are ways to skip both of these 2 packs without too much effort being invested. These 2, you're going to have to use something, an Invis Pod, a Shroud, Saps, Mind Suits, and then we get in here, do this trash, boss, this trash, and finish off the dungeon. So that's the new Spires with Skips route that I'm suggesting. More difficult, I would say, but much faster, and yeah, I mean, I'm actually, you know what, the other route is difficult too. The thing is, there's no good way to do Spires without difficulty, so at least this way you get rewarded for it, is my thinking. But there's a couple of good ways to do this dungeon, so if you have a way that you like with your group, I'd recommend sticking with it. This is a dungeon where there's a lot of different optimal ways to do it, depending on what you're optimizing for. Okay, Necrotic Wake. Dungeon with Necrotic in the name. Interestingly, it's one of the ones that I have not found to be that bad of a Necrotic dungeon compared to some of the others. I haven't found the bosses or the trash to be too brutal with the Affix. The trash has a lot of casters and a lot of little mobs that you can kill pretty quick. You do want to make sure that you avoid them stacking too much Necrotic on you, so AoE crowd control to keep the mobs from autoing the tank is pretty valuable. Also, just kind of like doing this slow kite where you're not actually running far away, but you're just backing up like 5 yards from the mobs and kind of keeping it so that they're not all autoing you all the time. And if you just slowly are doing that, you actually keep the mobs pretty grouped up. You're not losing too much damage on them as a group. You get to keep hitting stuff as well, but you can stop like 50% of the auto attacks from going through on you, and that just makes you twice as tanky, which is very valuable. So I'd recommend that kind of movement for a lot of these pulls, actually. And yeah, then bosses, not too rough with Necrotic either. These haven't been the ones that I've found to be too bad. The Necropolis area is one that you're, of course, going to want to take great care with, as with any week. But, I mean, yeah, the affixes are, I mean, let's not sugarcoat things. The affixes are tough. The affixes are tough everywhere. But this one's not, it's not the worst of the ones out there. Then finally, Theater of Pain. So Theater of Pain actually got a submission of some notes to suggest how to force specific mini bosses to be active in this wing. So I'll use this section to talk about that this week, which is, for those who don't know, you can actually, when you walk into a room, the way it works is that the next duelist to attack will win whenever you walk into the room. Because they basically hit each other for no damage, and then as soon as you walk into the room, the next hit does 100% of the thing's health and just one-shots it. So these notes here and here tell you how to go into these rooms and fight the more optimal duelist, the easier one to fight. In this room, you want to enter just after Nekthara's sword goes on back, and then that will mean that you get to fight Nekthara instead of Dokig. And then in this room, you enter the area, so that's like you can kind of imagine a little line created by the circle over here. You cross that threshold when the red arrow appears over Rek's head, and that will let you fight Rek instead of Advent. So, cool stuff. I'm not, this is the kind of thing where you're going to want to try it a couple times. Actually, you can write this stuff, but it takes some amount of just practice to actually learn, like, okay, where's the boundary that I actually need to cross? What do these things actually look like? But if you do that, you can fight easier mobs, not have to deal with some of the harder combinations of abilities that some of them have. It's not too big a deal on Tyrannical Week. In fact, with Tyrannical Necrotic, these mobs in particular are going to be a respite compared to the multi-target packs that will stack Necrotic on your tank a lot more quickly. But it's still something that's good to know. So that's it. That's the dungeons. That's what we got going this week. Hope you enjoyed the video, as always. Good luck out there. It's not an easy week. So, I don't know, I've said that like 7 times, but it's a hard one out there. So, good luck. Thanks for watching. Check out my stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. And hit subscribe and like and stuff. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.